In the early decades of the 2300s, EarthGov looked outward, away from a choking homeworld, and toward the cold promise of the Sol system. Earth was crowded, starved of resources, and suffocating beneath the weight of its own population. The solution, they claimed, lay among the moons and planets beyond the sky. Corporations were enlisted as the architects of this new frontier. They brought funding, machinery, and the comforting illusion of progress. Among them, pan-planetary prospecting was tasked with one of the harshest assignments of all: Ganymede. The settlers who signed on were fed hopeful stories. They were told the underground habitats were temporary, mere shelters while atmospheric domes were constructed and radiation shielding was put into place. Endure the dark, they were promised, and one day you would be able to walk beneath an open sky. Children would play on the surface, and the sunlight would return. But Ganymede was not a world that yielded easily. As the years passed, then decades, the domes remained distant concepts, trapped in feasible reports and budget projections. The shielding required to survive Ganymede's radiation proved far more complex than advertised. Timelines stretched, then quietly vanished. What had been sold as a waiting period revealed itself to be a life sentence. The first settlers would never see the surface. They lived and died beneath the ice and stone. Building a colony meant not for themselves, but for descendants they would never meet. Generations born into tunnels and artificial light, inheriting a promise that had already been broken the moment their ancestors arrived. When it became undeniable that the underground habitats were not temporary, that no shuttle or lift would ever carry them to the surface, the first generation of colonists fractured. Hope rotted. Some turned inward, hollowed out by despair, going through the motions of work and sleep as if already buried. Others reached for meaning wherever it could be found. That was when the Church of Unitology took root on Ganymede. What began as quiet gatherings, whispers of purpose, promises of transcendence beyond flesh and stone, grew into a movement. Unitology offered something EarthGov and the corporations never could: an explanation for suffering. The tunnels were not a prison, they said, but a crucible. The colonists were not abandoned, but chosen. This fate did not sit well with the Colonial leadership. As Unitologists' influence spread, tensions mounted with the security forces. These forces were organized and led by Chief Pioneer Reno, a hardline commander who viewed the growing religion as a destabilizing threat. Clashes followed, first ideological, then physical. Faith and authority collided in the dark, each convinced the other would doom the colony. Despite the unrest, construction pressed on year after year, generation after generation. Children were born who never knew Earth, never expected to see the surface, and never questioned why the sky existed only in the stories. Over time, the impossible slowly became real. Radiation shielding improved, atmospheric systems stabilized. What had once been fantasy turned, at last, into steel and glass. The first domes rose over Marius' landing, Ganymede's capital, marking humanity's long-delayed emergence into open space. Surface cities followed: Aniki Katina, Galileo Reach, each a monument to endurance measured in lifetimes rather than years. At Aniki Katina, the Unitologists left their most endearing mark. There beneath the artificial sky, they raised a colossal cathedral. It became the spiritual heart of the moon, the headquarters of Ganymede's Unitologist chapter, and a stark reminder that while EarthGov had built the colony's body, belief had claimed its soul. By the 2500s, the slow decay of Ganymede could no longer be ignored. The corridors were still lit, the domes still held, but something essential had begun to rot. More and more voices whispered the same accusation, that EarthGov had quietly turned its back on the colony. Officially, Ganymede still belonged to EarthGov. In reality, funding dried up, and governance became an afterthought. Attention has shifted elsewhere, to richer skies and easier profits. To Saturn. Investors, corporations, and policymakers alike have become fixated on the moons of that distant giant. especially Titan Station, where orbit buzzed with industry and ambition. Titan had become the beating heart of the planet-cracking trade, a place where entire worlds could be broken open for their resources. Compared to that scale of profit, Ganymede felt old, stubborn, and inconvenient, a relic of an earlier expansion era that refused to die quietly. When the USG Ashimura was lost in 2508, the illusion finally shattered. Planet cracking was exposed for what it truly was: uncontrollable and lethal on a scale few had dared to imagine. Official statements followed, investigations, public condemnations. On paper, the industry was disgraced. But money has a short memory. Even after the disaster, the Saturn moons remained irresistible to investors. Infrastructure is already in place. The risk, many argued, has simply been mismanaged, not fundamentally flawed. Titan and his neighboring colonies continued to grow, drawing resources, attention, and people away from Ganymede. Ships left the moon daily, workers, families, entire bloodlines abandoning tunnels their ancestors had carved out. Each departure hollowed the colony further. Shops closed, districts went dark. Fate lingered, but even belief struggled to survive without bodies to sustain it. Ganymede did not fall in a single catastrophe. It was bled dry. Until all that remained was a moon that had given everything it had, only to be forgotten once it was no longer profitable. As Ganymede emptied, another danger crept closer. The radiation shielding that kept the surface cities alive was never meant to last forever. It drank power endlessly, a constant battle against Jupiter's lethal radiation belts. By the mid-2500s, rumors spread through maintenance crews and engineering decks like a contagion. The underground generators were failing, fuel reserves were thinning, and the backup systems were decades past their intended lifespan. One day soon, the shields would flicker, and then go dark. If that happened, the cities would not slowly decay, they would be killed in minutes. The public was never told how close the colony stood to that edge. Official statements spoke of temporary shortages and scheduled infrastructure reviews. Behind closed doors, Ganymede's leadership understood the truth. Without a new, overwhelming source of energy, the moon was already dead, and desperation breeds dangerous ideas. In secret, far from the eyes of investors and remaining EarthGov observers, Ganymede's government reached out to EarthGov for help. What they received was not a reactor, not a fleet, or even evacuation orders. It was a marker, a red marker, newly created as part of EarthGov's marker replication program. Research accelerated in the aftermath of the Aegis 7 catastrophe. The project had intensified after the capture of Isaac Clarke. The logic was simple. Markers generated vast, inexplicable amounts of energy. If harnessed, even imperfectly, could power the radiation shields indefinitely. The cities could survive, the exodus might stop, and Ganymede could endure a little longer. No public vote was ever held, and no announcement was ever made. The marker was simply smuggled into the depths of the moon, lowered into the sealed chambers far beneath the cities it was meant to protect. The people of Ganymede slept beneath the artificial skies, unaware that their survival now depended on an object that had already doomed entire worlds. The marker was entombed far beneath Marius' landing, lowered into a reinforced chamber where the old generators once groaned and failed. When it was activated, the effect was immediate and undeniable. Power surged through the colony systems. The radiation shields stabilized, stronger than they had been for decades. For the first time in years, engineers stopped speaking in contingency plans and evacuation timelines. To the public, the miracle was explained away as a technological breakthrough. Few questioned the source of this sudden abundance. Few still wanted to. But the cost arrived quietly. The marker's signal bled upward, through kilometers of rock and alloy, threading itself into the minds of those who lived beneath its shadow. Sleeplessness became common. Hallucinations followed. People reported voices murmuring just beyond hearing, shapes moving where nothing stood. Hospitals filled up, not with the wounded, but with the broken. Doctors labeled as stress, mass hysteria, and radiation sickness. but none of those explanations truly fit. The Church of Unitology recognized the signal the moment it began to sing. To them, it was not corruption. It was revelation. The marker beneath Marius' landing was proof that Ganymede had been chosen. Slowly, the church moved. Technicians loyal to Unitology replaced secular engineers. Security staff found themselves reassigned, transferred, or quietly removed. Oversight committees dissolved into bureaucratic fog. Each change was small enough to escape notice. Until there was no one left who did not answer to the church. By 2510, the transformation was complete. The colonial government discovered, too late, that it no longer controlled the facility that powered its cities. When officials protested, the church informed the colonial parliament that the marker was now a religious matter, not a civic one. In all matters concerning it, the church would decide. Ganymede's leaders remained in their seats, their titles intact, but authority had drained away, replaced by doctrine. By 2511, the strain finally snapped. What had been once whispered in hospital wards and behind sealed apartment doors spilled out into the open streets of Enki Cantina. Marco dementia was no longer an isolated affliction. It was everywhere. Families watched loved ones unravel. Workers collapsed at their posts, muttering voices only they could hear. The church preached destiny. The government issued silence. And the people had had enough. Crowds gathered beneath the domes. They shouted accusations at the colonial government that no longer protected them, no longer even pretended to listen. Ganymede had been neglected, abandoned, and lied to, kept alive by a secret power source that was clearly poisoning its population. The name of EarthGov was spat like a curse. For a brief moment, it was still a protest. Then the colonial police arrived. They were wearing body armor and were armed to the teeth. They moved to disperse the crowds. Commands were shouted, lines drawn, and someone threw the first object. Weapons were raised in response. The first shots shattered the illusion of control. The police opened fire into the mass of civilians, their weapons tearing through the bodies in the open streets. Panic exploded outward. The protesters ran, falling over each other and screaming. Some tried to fight back with bare hands and stolen tools. Others were trampled underfoot as the domes echoed with gunfire. Each death fed the next wave of violence. The bloodshed radicalized those who survived, turning grief into fury and fear into certainty. Whatever legitimacy the colonial government had died in those streets, drowned out by the sound of automatic fire. Families ran through smoke-choked corridors and shattered plazas, carrying children, dragging the injured, and abandoning the homes they would never return to. The government had lost control of the city, and the radiation shields were beginning to fail. Crowds flooded the launch concourses, pounding on locked gates, screaming at port authorities to let them through. Shuttles were fueled in haste. Others collapsed into desperation as people fought for seats, for airlocks, for any chance to escape Ganymede alive. Then something else came from below, deep underground. The tunnels where bodies had been quietly discarded, hidden away from hospitals already overwhelmed, became something far worse than mass graves. From those depths, necromorphs emerged, twisted shapes clawing their way up through maintenance shafts and service corridors, drawn by the noise of the living. They reached the spaceport as the last shuttles were boarding. The attack was sudden and merciless. Screams cut through the chaos as the creatures tore into the fleeing crowds. Security lines collapsed instantly. People were dragged down within sight of open airlocks, their cries swallowed by alarms and engine roar. In the confusion, one shuttle, the Vespucci, attempted an emergency launch and never made it. Whether struck during liftoff, sabotaged by damage, or overwhelmed by sheer disorder on the launch pad, the shuttle lost control and crashed into a fireball that lit the underside of the dome. Burning debris rained across the spaceport, sealing exits and killing any hope of evacuation. Emilian Ayaba, a reporter who had refused to evacuate in order to document the riots, was seized in the streets by the Unitologist operatives. While the city tore itself apart above, she was taken below, far below, into the sealed facility beneath Marius' landing, where the red marker lay entombed. The church did not treat her as a prisoner. They treated her as an offering. To the church, Ayaba represented more than a voice that could expose them. She was a witness, a mind unbroken, someone who could hear and then carry the truth of the marker to the surface world. If she could be made to believe, truly believe, she would become proof of their doctrine. In the depths of the facility, surrounded by chanting clergy and flickering instruments, the Unitologist rerouted the marker's signal, focusing it inward, narrowing its reach, forcing a moment of direct communion. They wanted Ayuba to communicate with it, to listen, to be changed. However, this diversion of energy starved the colony's systems of power. Above ground, without warning or explanation, the radiation shields faltered, and then failed entirely. The invisible protection that stood between life and Jupiter's wrath simply vanished. Radiation washed through the open streets, transit lines, and evacuation routes, burning unseen but lethal paths through the population. People collapsed where they stood. Others staggered blindly indoors, too late to matter. Panic spread again, sharper than before, as emergency alerts screamed and then fell silent. By the time the shields were restored, the damage had already been done. The church claimed it was a necessary risk, a sacrifice in pursuit of transcendence, another step towards convergence. The riots had torn through the streets. The spaceport at Necromorph lay in ruins. The brief failure of the radiation shields had sickened and killed untold numbers, and beneath it all, the truth of the Necromorph outbreak spread into frightened whispers, bodies that would not stay dead. Into that silence, the Church of Unitology stepped forward. Now in full and uncontested control of the red marker, the church offered what the colonial government no longer could: aid. Unitologist medics appeared in the streets and shelters, tending to the wounded, calming the terrified. They provided food, shelter, and treatment when official systems failed to respond. To many survivors, it looked like salvation. Public support surged, not because the church was trusted, but because it was present. The Necromorph outbreak at the spaceport was never publicly explained. Official reports claimed it had been contained. No further sightings were acknowledged. Shuttle access remained restricted, but the killings stopped. And for most civilians, that was enough. Whether through forced secrecy or darker methods, the threat vanished from view. Soon after, the church announced the opening of a new oncology ward within the medical complex, adjoining the Necromorph Cathedral. It was a compassionate response. Specialized care for those suffering radiation exposure after the shield failure. However, those who entered were rarely seen again. Behind sterile walls and religious iconography, the church continued its work. Survivors whispered that the patients were being studied, not healed. Their bodies were transferred at night. Thus the same forces responsible for the horrors beneath the moon were now being examined, refined, and deliberately cultivated. The Unitologists were preparing Ganymede for something. By 2512, Ayuba, once a reporter documenting the collapse of Ganymede, now stood at the center of its future. Whatever she had seen beneath Marius' landing had not broken her. It had remade her. She spoke with certainty, a conviction sharpened by revelation, and the people listened. To a population traumatized by riots, radiation exposure, and monsters in the streets, Ayuba sounded like someone who finally understood the truth behind their suffering. Backed openly by the Church of Unitology, she became one of the leading candidates in the next Colonial Parliament election. She promised stability, reforms, and protection from further catastrophe. Her rise signaled something far more profound. The Church no longer needed to rule from the shadows. It could rule openly. By then, Ganymede was already slipping from EarthGov's grasp. The real power flowed through Unitologist hands, through their hospitals, shelters, and energy systems. With the red marker secured and the population increasingly aligned with the church doctrine, the moon was being reshaped into something deliberate. Not merely a colony, a sanctuary, a staging ground. As the church consolidated control over Ganymede, its ambitions extended far beyond Jupiter's orbit. At the same time, Ayuba's influence grew locally. Unitologist cells across human space intensified their efforts against EarthGov. The marker replication programs EarthGov believed it controlled were already compromised. All of it led towards one single, inevitable rupture. In 2514, the tension exploded into open conflict. The Unitologist uprising across multiple colonies, coordinated attacks targeted EarthGov installations, housing red marker test sites. Security forces were overwhelmed, and Necromorph outbreaks erupted almost simultaneously, ripping through the settlements that believed themselves safe. The church had not merely survived neglect, it had endured, adapted, and prepared. And with Ayaba as its public face, Ganymede was no longer just another forgotten colony. It became the heart of something vast, something patient, something waiting for convergence.